Hello, my name's David Burton, and I'm the County Engagement Specialist with University of Missouri Extension, headquartered in Greene County, Missouri. That's Springfield, Missouri is the county seat. So I wanted to share a presentation, just an overview of our Engaged Neighbor program and what it means to be neighboring. It's an idea that's sweeping the nation, especially here as we come out of the COVID pandemic and people start making social connections again. So just want to give you a little primer on the subject, and thankful that you've joined in and listened today. I hope you find this 30-minute presentation of interest to you. Again, our neighboring program with University of Missouri Extension is called the Engaged Neighbor. The idea here that a neighbor who's engaged with their neighbors and in their community is a better leader, and the community is better served by their presence. My contact information can be found on the University of Missouri Extension website, but I share it with you here. Feel free to call me or to email me at the MU Extension office. I've been here for nearly 20 years, enjoy my work and the organization. Now, on to neighboring. How has neighboring changed over the years? Well, when you consider that definition of neighboring, it has certainly evolved. And when you consider what people expect about their neighbor, that has certainly evolved. Once upon a time, being neighborly meant reaching out to people who live next door to you. It meant, among other things, offering to watch your neighbor's kids in a pinch, maybe picking up their mail when they went on a trip, watching their house or laying out their dog if they were gone, visiting with each other on the porch or along the sidewalk or along the picket fence, being able to borrow things like a tool or a cup of sugar. When Harvard Medical School ran a study asking people what they expected from their neighbor, those were the types of answers that they got in the 1950s when they ran that study. Now, as a child of the 80s, when I grew up in the 80s, we had neighbors that would drop by the house all the time. There was always a pound cake in the kitchen under glass that was strictly for the use of our neighbors, that and a cup of Sanka. And that was what I grew up with, but it was still a friendly atmosphere and we knew all of our neighbors' names. But things have changed. Harvard Medical School actually reran that same study using that same question from the 1950s in 2016. And the answers they got were like 180 degrees different from the 1950s. Basically, the responses in 2016 could be summed up in this way. Being neighborly means leaving those around you in peace and leaving them alone. That's how many have come to define being a good neighbor, not bothering the people around you. I'm on a mission to change that narrative about neighboring, what we expect and how we benefit from the active engagement of neighboring and from neighboring ourselves. Doing this is an easy way to change the world, really. Being a good neighbor is an easy way to change your community. It's an easy way to change your immediate neighborhood. And it has roots in our nation's history. You go back to the 1830s, Alexis de Tocqueville, a Frenchman, toured the United States, and then he went back and wrote a book called Democracy in America. And he said the secret to the American experiment was our connectivity in townships and through associations. These were ways that we gathered to socialize and to work out problems. And it created a type of grassroots democracy from the bottom up, instead of what we have now, more from the top down. And really this lack of interaction and working together in association has further increased our political divide, our political and social divide, I might add. The lack of knowing or even wanting to know your neighbors is causing a tear in our social fabric. And neighboring is at the very root of that issue. Here in the Greene County Extension Office, we have several programs that I'm doing that relate to this topic of neighboring. One, we have 8 pilot project neighborhoods in the county, working with leaders in those neighborhoods. We do a quarterly newsletter for every resident. We're offering scholarships for various programs to people in those neighborhoods to try and develop leaders. We're working to create neighborhood directories in those neighborhoods and offering to help conduct a block party in each of those neighborhoods. I also offer a class each month via Zoom online called Neighboring 101. We hear from the leaders in this movement and people that are practitioners that share their success stories. We hear from them during this Zoom session. And if you register, you can attend the session live, or you can get access to the recording of the class when it comes out afterward. And then, as I mentioned, our Engaged Neighbor program, really sort of called Becoming an Engaged Neighbor is what I've tried to call it. And there's a lot of things that go into that program in addition to these things I've already mentioned. One is we're doing pilot projects with area businesses and their employees, tying together some of the things we learned from neighboring and about how to build relationships and tying that into the workplace and to creating a more cohesive workplace. I have two of those pilot projects going on now. Then the program Lawn, which is lawn art with neighbors, done in partnership with Missouri State University and their art program. This is a public art event in the spring where neighbors are encouraged to do art installations in their front yard. People tour around and see those, but we also encourage people to work on those with their neighbors. That's a fun aspect of that. I'm working on some pilot projects in the area of neighboring with area churches. And then also our annual Neighborhood Leadership Academy, which is a 10-week course designed to really train up and provide leadership skills to people, to area students who can then turn around and put their leadership skills to practice in their neighborhood. But there are also some unique programs and events that we have piloted and are conducting as part of the Engaged Neighbor program. One of those is National Good Neighbor Day. Now, obviously, that is not our holiday, but in Greene County in 2021, we initiated what we're calling the 1,000 Acts of Neighboring Challenge. Thanks to friends of ours in the news media and other sponsors, we're working hard to get the word out that during this week, we want people to do an act of kindness for their neighbor. It could be as simple as a plate of cookies. It could be mowing a yard. It could be having someone over for dinner. The sky's the limit. We have a list on our website of 100 different ideas of what it could be. Then you log into our website and take a survey and report on yourself what action you took. And in doing so, you help us try and reach this goal of 1,000 acts, but you also enter yourself into a random drawing for great prizes and gift cards. And also, every community in Greene County, someone from every community will be named the Neighbor of the Year, the best example of neighboring in that community. And we'll judge those and select those from the submissions we receive. Another good time to do a program revolves around Won't You Be My Neighbor Day, which is March 20th. That's Mr. Rogers' birthday. This past year, we did that program with the Springfield Greene County Library. We documented 100 acts of kindness from library patrons, and we had some guest speakers online. And I hope to repeat that yearly as we kind of design a week that leads up to and celebrates the life of Mr. Rogers and what it means to be a good neighbor. So I have a confession to make. I was a wonderful neighbor until I realized I wasn't. See, I fell in that trap from the 1950s. I mowed my yard, I raked up my leaves, I don't throw loud parties, and I always pick up after my dog when I take him on a walk. I thought, this makes me the perfect neighbor. But I read a book, The Art of Neighboring by Dave Runyon, and then I called and talked to Dave Runyon, and I discovered I was a pretty stinky neighbor. My wife and I have lived in this same house 18 years now, and many of the neighbors have come and gone. And when people moved away, we didn't really even bother to get to know them. That's on me. I'm ashamed to say that we had that much apathy. But I've discovered since reading that book and other books here now too, that connecting with my neighbors, connecting with the people that live in proximity to me is wonderful for my neighborhood, wonderful for them, and great for me as well. and I get to form friendships and mix and mingle with people that I might not otherwise come in regular contact with. And I have seen the benefits of neighboring, that is for sure. I often ask people, can you imagine what it would be like if you knew and had interaction with your neighbors? What sort of good things might happen if you truly got to know the people in your neighborhood and they truly got to know you? What types of things would happen from those relationships? For one, I know in our case, when my wife was diagnosed with cancer, because we had been developing these neighbor relationships, we immediately knew that two of our neighbor ladies had had cancer before, and they were able to be supportive of Stacy and were a bit of a support network for her. There have been times that we've been able to be first responders for our neighbors who have had problems, and because of our proximity, because we were close, because there was a level of trust and relationship, they reached out to us first. Can you help us? I know I've done that before when I had an accident. And really, we've had fun. Making these connections in your neighborhood are fun. We've had social interaction and cookouts on our driveway, and it's been a blast. And that's only been possible because we put in an effort to get to know our neighbors. Now, a lot of Americans don't know their neighbors. There's a ton of different studies and research on this topic. Some show as low as 3% of Americans know their neighbors. One that I think is particularly valid shows that 10% of Americans, less than 10%, know their 8 closest neighbors. They're pretty lenient in how they define that. But that's still an abysmal number. We can do better. And really, in a State Farm research study done in 2015, we found that fewer than 20% of people say that they think it's important to know their neighbors. So again, this is capturing that narrative or recapturing that narrative of why it is important to be a good neighbor and to know our neighbors. Now, meanwhile, while we have these numbers about lack of neighboring, we have other studies showing a huge spike in loneliness in America. And this is really even pre-COVID. People of younger and younger ages saying they're lonely. Could it be that the answer to your loneliness is right across the street, or perhaps right next door? And our lack of face-to-face social interaction can cause deeper social problems. Our decreases in association has led to deeper political and social problems. There is a connection. If you're frustrated by those things, then begin by getting to know and forming relationships with your 8 closest neighbors. Now, generally, from the reading I have done, the research I am doing, the people I have talked with, it seems to me there are 4 basic approaches to neighboring, or 4 reasons why people get motivated to do more neighboring. One is because they realize that neighboring increases place attachment and their own quality of life. Robert Putnam in Bowling Alone shows us that getting to know your neighbors and neighborhood actually leads to a reduction in crime of 60%. So there is that factor. And place attachment, this is even important in economic development and communities. When they feel attached to their place of living, they're more likely to spend money there and more likely to take up responsibility of a leader as well. A second factor is neighboring actually improves your health versus loneliness. Being chronically lonely has the same detrimental impact on your body as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. It is that dramatic. Being neighborly really does improve your life. People who have a strong social network recover from surgeries faster, are sick less. Again, Harvard Medical School did a study. They started in the 1930s with a group of freshmen to track their happiness, how they felt, how they rated their happiness. And this is one of the longest studies of all time. They continued to track these people up until their death, 80 years later. And those in the study that repeatedly identified themselves as the most happy were those that had the strongest social networks. So a third reason for going into neighboring is that it does provide a community benefit and it does develop leaders. Some people just want to see their town do better. Some want to see other people speak up and take part in school board or city council or other activities around town. Some just want to help put on a festival. I know a lady who decided she wanted to organize a chalk art festival for her town. And when people feel attached to their community, they're more likely to do those things. And that attachment begins by knowing your neighbors. So neighboring provides that benefit. And then fourthly, for some, loving a neighbor is really part of a calling or a command. And that is why they spend their time developing those relationships and loving their neighbors, because they feel called to do so. 4 different approaches to that idea. For me, it basically comes down to this. If you want a friendlier neighborhood or community, you got to begin by being the change you want to see. Once I was convicted that I need to be a better neighbor, it wouldn't do me any good to sit in my house on my sofa watching Netflix saying, I sure wish someone would be a better neighbor. That wouldn't get it done. Someone has to be the spark plug. Someone has to be the connector. And so if you want a friendlier neighborhood, if you want a friendlier community, you have to begin by being the change you want to see. Now, everyone is not my neighbor. I've heard people say that. Everyone in the whole town is my neighbor. Everyone everywhere is my neighbor. And the problem is when we aim for everything, we hit nothing. So when we insist that we're neighbors with everybody, we often end up being neighbors with nobody. We'll go out and we'll do fun things, and other people say, oh, look at me, I'm neighboring. And meanwhile, we don't even know the names of the people that live next door. Dave Runyon, in his book, The Lost Art of Neighboring, has this great line where he says that we have metaphoric neighbors, we have metaphoric love for our metaphoric neighbors, and metaphorically, we're killing it. But meanwhile, we don't even know the names of our neighbors. So it's easy to say everyone is your neighbor, but really you have to put into action with those that live right around you. Proximity makes neighboring a whole lot easier. Now, how I define neighboring in our Engaged Neighbor program is neighboring is the art and skill of building relationships with the people who live in the closest proximity to you. And I hope, surely we're not too busy to be friendly to the neighbors that live right next door. So you've committed yourself, you're going to do some neighboring. How do you start? Well, Dave Runyon in his book kind of lists 3 ideas. He says, learn your neighbors' names, use your neighbors' names, and throw great parties. Those are great examples. I add a 4th one in there, and that is to connect with neighbors over shared interests. Yes, learn their names, use their names, throw great parties, and then connect over shared interest. But you do have to lead by example. This is one of the tools that we have used. It's modeled after something that Dave Runyon had in the Art of Neighboring. It's a neighborhood grid. Your home is right in the very middle. If you're like me, I have a hard time remembering names sometimes. So when I discover that name of a new neighbor, when I meet them for the first time, I immediately go home and write it down, write it in one of these squares so I can see it and remember it. And then also that square, put in contact information, put in interest, things that help you remember them so you can use their name and have a good conversation when you see them the next couple of times in person. Then also contact information so you can get in touch. If you get really good at your 8, maybe expand out from that in your neighborhood. But this is a great tool to help you with your memory, to help you to know. And taking that time to get to know names pays a tremendous dividend. It can be as simple as doing a driveway chat. Neighboring is a low and slow process. It takes time. I often say it's a process. It's a process. Hospitality is key. You have to demonstrate and exhibit hospitality to other people. In my neighborhood in 2021, we initiated something called a driveway chat. We kept it simple. Took place in the evening, 6:30 to 8:30. Bring your lawn chair, come to a driveway, chat and visit with your neighbors. No food was promised. No games were promised. We rotated the host around to different homes that would volunteer to do that. Many times those homes would have a small plate of food out or for some games, but that was never really part of the deal. It was to come and visit with your neighbors. So the first time we did this, I had 6 people show up. That was a little discouraging, but it was more than 0. The second time we got together, we had 24. Then we had 38. Then we had 46. And finally, for our last driveway chat of the summer, we had a snowball or snow cone wagon come in, did free snow cones. We had 64 people show up for our driveway chat. Some people met each other for the first time on this driveway. I had one gentleman come and I heard people saying, "Do you live in our neighborhood? Where do you live?" He doesn't get out of his home too often, but he got out for snow cones and for the fellowship with other neighbors. And really that has got me to thinking and kind of changing my mind about what it means to do a block party. My goal used to be, when I thought of a block party, I'd think it had to be a cookout. You had to feed everybody. It had to be a big event. And I know that scares people off from wanting to do one. But because of this experience with driveway chats, my opinion has changed. My goal now is for 2 neighbors that don't know each other before to walk away from the event knowing one thing about each other. If they do that, then mission accomplished, goal accomplished. With neighborhood gatherings, we really need to move away from the did I entertain my neighbors trap that we so often fall into and look at it differently. We don't need to entertain our neighbors. We need to help them know each other and know something about each other. That should be the goal of our block parties. Now, neighboring has all sorts of benefits to a town. I worked with one community that estimated 50% of their phone traffic in their city hall could be resolved if neighbors just talk to each other. Here's an example. This happened in Republic, Missouri, 4 or 5 years ago. When we did an event out here, this is some of the feedback we got. We had a lady who was pregnant. Her husband was working nights. She was confined to her bed. Their yard got out of control because of his work schedule. Apparently, she didn't know any of the neighbors. None of the neighbors apparently even knew she was pregnant or didn't know her well enough to know that. And so they called the city on her, and she got a ticket for having tall grass and not mowing her yard. And she wrote how that had changed her mind about what it means to be a good neighbor. If her neighbors had known her, if they'd had a relationship, she could have called on someone to mow her yard for her. But better yet, if you were a good neighbor and you knew she was confined to bed, I bet you would have started your mower and gone over and mowed the yard for her. That would help maintain relationship and would be such a better approach than calling the city to ticket them. And it would save taxpayer dollars because it would save some of the expense that goes into enforcing things like that in the city. Well, the reason I'm neighboring, I think I mentioned this earlier when we were discussing the 4 options, is because I want to love my neighbor. And now many people think, I already love my neighbor, because they think that the opposite of love is hate. But you see, the opposite of love is apathy. The opposite of love is not even caring enough about your neighbors to check on them. The opposite of love is not even caring enough to get to know their name or have interaction with them. The opposite of love is apathy. You know, for a while in my own life, when new neighbors moved in, I didn't really even care enough to go and meet them. And if I did meet them, I sure didn't remember their name or try and develop a relationship. And I'm here to tell you, I was wrong in doing that. Better neighbor relations has its own rewards. You know, personally, I don't believe my address is an accident, and neither are my neighbors. And I want to be able to make that connection and have those healthy relationships for my benefit and for theirs. Well, I often get asked about what books I recommend on this topic. And when I talked to my regional director several years ago about developing a neighboring program, one of the things he challenged me to do was come up with a good resource list. Look at the research, look at the sources, come up with a good list of books and read them. Well, I've come up with like a 6-page list of research and sources. This is an exploding field. And I certainly have my favorite books. And I want to encourage you to read more on this subject. But it's also important that you talk about neighboring in your sphere of influence and raise awareness so you can increase the conversation around this topic. So when you read a good book, talk to others about it. Put some of what you read in practice. Some of those books I've already mentioned, The Art of Neighboring by Dave Runyon, John McKnight's book, The Abundant Community. He is the father of asset-based community development. Dr. Murthy, the Together book, that came out in 2021. He's the United States Surgeon General. Kristen Schell, The Turquoise Table, about a picnic table that ended up in her front yard because they didn't have room in the back, and what a gathering place it became for the community. Melanie Warnock writes a nice overview book called This Is Where You Belong. It's really about creating a sense of belonging, but several chapters address neighboring specifically. The Vanishing Neighbor by Mark Dunkelman. That's where I got the Harvard Medical Study information from. It's a great book with lots of data, and I think data can support our decision making. Next Door as It Is in Heaven is a nice book for some authors in the Kansas City area, Lance Ford. Place for a Purpose is by two friends of mine in Columbia, Missouri, Chris and Elizabeth McKinney. It's being discussed a lot nationally now. And then The Village Effect by Sarah Pinkler. This is a fascinating read. She takes a look at a lot of studies that reinforce this idea that neighboring is good for our health. Really good nonfiction book with lots of research. Would highly recommend her book as well. Now, really, when people read books like this, when you're talking about neighboring, if you take on a local neighboring activity, if anyone talks about neighboring, we all win. If anyone talks about neighboring, we all win. So I encourage you to keep the conversation going. You can take my neighboring survey. It's online. You can look for the Engage Neighbor program on the MU Extension website. You can take the short survey there. You'll get access to this Google Doc. It's 150 pages. It includes my list of source documents. And again, I'm always glad to visit on this topic of neighboring. It's so important to our communities, to our areas in which we live, and to myself. I mean, to yourself personally. It is good for your health. And really, if you're watching this around the time of National Good Neighbor Day, there's no better time to start than right now. Make National Good Neighbor Day your starting point. Register, enroll in my Neighboring 101 class, or perhaps register in my Becoming an Engaged Neighbor class as well. We'd love to see you in either one of those classes. And again, my name is David Burton. I'm with Greene County MU Extension, and this has been a topic of neighboring.